All right, welcome everyone. Happy Friday. It's great to see you all here and see a full room, folks coming in before a holiday week. Welcome to the Grantmakers for Education Out of School Time Impact Group monthly field convening call. These are our monthly calls that are open to funders and field leaders alike as an opportunity to lift up important field issues and create opportunities for folks to communicate with one another. I noticed a lot of people registering for today's session in particular, or leading up to today's session. So I know this is a topic on everybody's mind. We at the Out of School Time Impact Group create a space for learning and community building amongst funders and field leaders. We believe in high quality programs and access to all children and youth across the country. And in order to do that, we need to have sustainable programs. And so I know many people are thinking about the expiring deadline of federal funding that we've all enjoyed having from ESSER funding and American Rescue Plan Act, and that so many communities have been able to build up their capacity to offer programs to youth. And it's going to be a challenge to sustain that level of programming. So today is just one conversation to highlight some strategies to address, how do you sustainably fund programs in communities? That could be through local, state, or federal funding. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Rebecca Goldberg, and I'm co-facilitator of the Impact Group with Kathleen Trapp-Hagan. And I'm really happy to have created this space today just to have some conversation and share resources with you all. We do have some speakers that are going to share some ideas and suggestions. And this is a really robust community with lots of people who have showed up today with ideas as well. So we do want to prepare you and invite you to, be active in the chat, share ideas, ask questions. We also should have time for certainly Q&A, but really we want to invite folks who may be working at this day to day. If you have other stories of success, things that you're working on around sustainable funding streams, we're going to invite folks to come on. So if you are someone who has an idea to share of a different approach to funding, think about that now and feel free to message me, because we would love to have a couple other voices come on to share approaches in your communities. As I said, we're going to share a number of resources. I'm excited about our first speaker today is Sarah Eicher from the Children's Funding Project, and we'll put her bio in the chat. But I love the fact that her title is actually Cost Modeling Coach. So Sarah thinks every day about sustainable funding for youth programs and public financing in particular, and what is the actual cost of those programs. So not just funding the bare minimum, but funding what they really cost. So I'm going to invite Sarah to come on and share some ideas and resources.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Thanks for that great intro. Yeah, like Rebecca said, I think about the true cost of providing programs and services to children and youth through cradle to career every day, all day. But I'll start sharing my screen really quick so we can get started. And it's so great to be here with you all today. I see a ton of folks joining from all over. So my name is Sarah Eicher, and I'm a cost modeling coach at Children's Funding Project. I'm currently Zooming in from Ann Arbor, Michigan. My colleague Allie is also on the call today, and she's our partnerships manager at CFP. So like Rebecca said today, and I'm so glad so many of you are interested in this, particularly with the ARPA funding clip. We'll be digging into funding out of school time now and in the future. So when we talk about cradle to career, how do we actually support young people? And this graphic really goes into everything that's involved in that. We want to support children and youth from cradle to career, especially in all of the time they spend outside the classroom, OST programs, all the programs that come with that, and the wraparound services that come in the classroom. But who's actually paying for them right now is really important to us, figuring out where the money is coming from And what's the true cost? Like Rebecca said, I'm really interested in not only knowing the true cost right now, but what does the true cost look like if we're thinking about providing adequate wages to staff or expanding slots in different OST programs? And where can the additional funds come from is really what we're going to be spending time on today. And what exactly do we need to pay for? So this graphic can be a little bit overwhelming with the whole list of different services and categories we have. But at CFP, we've identified core services and programs in these categories on the left. And then on the right are all the different services and programs that they really entail. And you'll see out of school time programs at the top of the list, but that also includes different nourishment programs and juvenile justice programs. So there's a lot of intersection between OST and different programs on the right as well. And we definitely know that the lion's share of funding for child and youth, for this child and youth system, including all of these programs and services, comes from public dollars. In our fiscal mapping work, which is something that CFP does a lot of, we find that without fail, private dollars usually make up less than 5%, which is pretty wild. We want to scale the programs and services that every child and young person needs over time. We need to think about them as a public good, which really requires thinking about them as a public investment. A children's funding project founded by Elizabeth Gaines, who you all might know pretty well. We created, Elizabeth has always really talked about having a laser focus on the money component of supporting children and youth in states, communities, and tribes. We always hear what gets measured gets done, but Elizabeth says over and over again, what gets budgeted gets done. So really making sure that these really important programs for children and youth are in the line items that we're all making. At CFP, we define strategic public financing as helping states and communities add a price tag to their goals for children and youth and identifying ways to cover the costs. So when it comes down to it, strategic public financing really breaks down to these three different questions. So looking at current funding, how much funding supports our goals right now as they are, and then needed funding, which is really where my expertise and focus is how much money will it cost to fund our goals in full? And then finally, we have additional funding right here at the bottom. And this last question we all know is really pressing right now, given the ARPA cliff. So what are the sources of funding that we can go after right now and in the next 2 years to sustain ARPA investments in OST? And, we've heard time and time again from intermediaries, but definitely OST providers, direct workers and managers. It can be stressful, different investments that have been made in staffing and professional development. So really making sure that we sustain that. And that's why we're going to focus on it today. So sustaining ARPA investments long-term really requires blending and braiding of multiple sources of funding. On the left, we have our, more common sources of funding. And we definitely want to continue these and keep advocating to increase these amounts where possible. But we also really want to start thinking about these different sources on the right. What strategies can your community or state be tapping into? Maybe some are not, your state or community is not fit well for some of these, but there's a ton of different options out there. And we really know that there's not one silver bullet, and we need to be sourcing funding from federal, state, and local levels. All of those together, thinking about blending and braiding, the common ones that we already have, advocating, but also really exploring some of the different ones that we can add. So we were really excited to partner with Afterschool Alliance and Grant Makers for Education to produce this fact sheet. There's a little snip on the left. It's funding out of school time programs now and in the future, which describes the funding sources on the table for OST. And it's not a fully comprehensive list, but we did want to put something out there in partnership with them that would get folks start thinking about different ways that they can think about additional sources and how people have used them in the past. So we organized the fact sheet by the categories on the right, which are federal. We do touch on federal funding sources, but the majority of the content is really focused on state and local funding sources. So you'll see that list right there at the bottom. And we also spotlight examples of how all of these strategies are being used to fund OST around the country. And, you know, there's ways that it's being used right now, all these different options, but there's also a lot more to be explored and dedicated for OST. And today we're also really excited to be hearing from a community leader a little bit later that has success in blending private and public funding streams for their OST programs. And thinking about how to use the fact sheet. So we didn't want to just put something out there and not think about the ways in which that it could be used and talked about. So one way to really kick off the conversation is just to take stock of the different options out there. From the last slide, you know, some of the different options could be the budget processes like allocation, tax revenue, bond, fees, assets, and different settlements. I know that opioid settlement dollars have been coming up a lot. And then to take it a step further, investigate which options are actually feasible in your context. So we know that not every community or state has marijuana revenue. We know that some areas have high tax and some don't. So really taking the time to weigh out and research more will help in narrowing down the options. Also connecting with state and local after-school networks or intermediaries to see which options they're already considering and actively pursuing. They have a ton of insight, you know, thinking about this day to day on what they currently have, the upcoming fiscal years, what gaps there might be. So they're great to connect with and see what options maybe they haven't thought of yet as well, and really building on what they're already pursuing. And lastly, but certainly not least, convening partners to determine which options to champion. You know, we've seen time and time again that the power from the collective decision making and the action going forward really helps drive some of these initiatives and successfully get some of these different funds. And we also have a communications toolkit that you all can share. And I think Allie, I don't know if she dropped it in the chat yet, but just to get started with some sample X or Twitter posts, sharing with different partners and collaborators or folks that you're even interested in working. You know, if you even sit down for a coffee chat and go through some of these and kind of explore what needs folks are seeing and what barriers to try to work on. And now we'll get into some of the example funding sources that we have in the fact sheet. So one of them is in-kind facilities usage. This has been coming up more and more, especially in out-of-school time in the conversations here at CFP. But governments can support youth serving providers by offering public facilities for youth services free of charge or at a discounted rate. I also want to add that, you know, there's many times that different community-based organizations also work well as partners on this. I know in my community, we have a community theater that holds space for arts programming. And I know that colleges and universities sometimes will provide different space for their athletic space, for sports out of school time programming too. And so a really great gold standard for this type of partnership is the Nashville Afterschool Alliance, where the public schools match $400,000 of city funding with in-kind facility usage, transportation, and staff support. And I know that this, you know, kind of focuses on in-kind facility usage just upfront, but staffing is also a huge one. I've seen that work really well, whether it be, you know, just somebody that's full-time going to different sites, and transportation has been coming up a lot. You know, there's bus shortages, staffing shortages. We're all experiencing that. So having help with, if it's the public school system, extending their busing program to get folks to and from their out of school time program. We know that access is a huge barrier for some of our young people. And so our next one, this one's a fun one. Payment in lieu of taxes are really agreements that provide tax breaks for companies to bring business to particular areas. And once one expires, the city can collect taxes from the company and use those revenues to support city expenses. Memphis, Tennessee is a good example of this. And they were thinking for tax rate toward universal pre-K, but the mayor of Memphis approved ordinances dedicating up to $6 million in funding for expired pilot programs in 2018. So this is a great example of a revenue source that a lot of folks might not know of or think of immediately, but it's definitely something to explore just to see if it would fit in your community or state. And general obligation bonds is another one. They're a subset of municipal bonds, which that provide a way for state and local governments to raise money for projects that may not generate a revenue stream. One of the ways I really like to think about this too is the way that Massachusetts used it. In 2013, they had a $45 million general obligation bond, and they actually used it for childcare, licensed large group programs, and out of school time. So grants up to $1 million. And I really think that this general obligation bonds, when I think about it, it really makes sense from the blending and braiding perspective too. If you're thinking about infrastructure and capital investments that are, every 5 or 10 years, depending on what's needed. So sometimes in different granting programs, the capital investments aren't necessarily a use for those grants. So this is a great way to kind of get the foundation, get some of these foundational things done, and then really blend in some of the other revenue sources that work well with their purpose usage. And finally, we just want to quickly spotlight one strategy we spend a lot of our time thinking about at CFP, and that's voter approved children's funds. And I'll say children's and youth funds. We really think about it cradle to career. And this is when communities go to the ballot to dedicate local public revenue to children and youth programs and services. And we have, local public funding dedicated to kids, children and youth, ballot measures. And one of the things that I think is really beautiful about voter approved children's funds is that it's really grassroots, and it brings a lot of people together that all have a goal so that, children and youth in their community can thrive, and whatever way that they can, interact with those children and youth, whether it be parent, family, provider, local leadership, it really galvanizes folks together. Many of the funds represented on this map of our voter approved children's funds as of 2023, they fund OST programs, but it's more of a comprehensive fund that also includes early education. And the momentum's really growing for first purely OST funds. Last month, we hosted our Children's Funding Institute, which was a 3-day boot camp for community teams going to the ballot. And of 23 of those that attended, 6 are considering moving towards ballot measures to establish dedicated funding for OST exclusively. So we're really excited to see all of this momentum really focused on OST specifically, and lots of opportunities for funders, intermediaries, policymakers to really build up a community's readiness to be successful in this. And so what can funders do, but also, not just exclusive to funders. These are all something that we can share in collectively. We do have a role of funder specific fact sheet for strategic public financing. But given the majority of funding for children and youth programs and services come from public sources, some of the most impactful investments, funders can make, but also other folks can really put their energy into, is to prepare the states and community to leverage these public funds. And thinking about building capacity is already on there, but really making sure that the experience and the goal is set up for success, just getting that foundation ready. And everybody's uniquely situated to help a state or community's readiness to go after the public funds in these different ways. And I think it's really great, especially at these meetups, is everybody has their own unique strengths and positioning in their community or organization. So, if you know a ton of people in the OST space, direct service providers, that's a huge strength for convening power. And the list could go on and on. But so really thinking about convening, bringing people together, if that's a strength, and community-wide, getting everybody on the same page, really thinking about shared goals and spending priorities for OST. Every community is so unique that a community's violence prevention needs aren't going to be the same as the next, trauma-informed needs. It all has a different priority level. Also, building capacity is huge. I mentioned this before, but thinking about that initial investment and having a children's funding coordinator is also a great way to build capacity in your community or state. And a children's funding coordinator, actually at CFP, we help hire and train and coach. So we call them CFCs for short, to think about what money is currently coming in. And then I work with them on figuring out what the true cost is for their goals and their ideal goals if they do want to expand or, go up in different quality levels for their programming. And then finally, sourcing additional revenue. So really, this person is thinking exclusively about all of these three components of strategic public financing together. So it's a great way to, have somebody to build capacity, but also help spread the narrative of why public investment is so great for a community or state. Research is also a really great way to get involved. Thinking about potential new sources of revenue. It can take, trying to really map the different revenue sources onto a community or state can be really intricate. There's different taxing authorities for different places. Voter approval or polling is going to be different for every place. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about what the voters will want, what would they support, what kind of work would need to be done if you want to kind of push them towards one of the options. And raise awareness. I just talked about they went together, research and building awareness, but really thinking about the importance of communicating with folks, neighbors, community members, state officials, and getting the narrative of public investment and out of school time programming as a public good. And it's great for all the young people in our lives and their lives, and it really needs to be a dedicated focus for it. So raising awareness is always a go-to one as well. And I think that is it. So thank you very much, everyone. I didn't get a chance to look at the chat, but I'll answer any questions too. And Anya will have a little Q&A later as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for all the great resources, Sarah, and ideas. Obviously, many of these are longer term approaches to funding, but as we, I think can all agree, we want the best for our young people and for families. So we hope you got some good resources, and we'll continue to look at the publications in the chat, and we'll share that funding guide as well. We hope that gets out to the field. So I'm going to invite Erik Peterson to come on now from the Afterschool Alliance. And to share a few additional thoughts and ideas around funding, and then we'll have a conversation with Maxine from Denver. So welcome, Erik.
There we go. Sorry, you can find mute. Thanks so much, Rebecca, and thanks, Sarah. as well for giving that great overview. So Erik Peterson again with the Afterschool Alliance. I am having some internet issues, so if I see you all freeze, I will assume that I paused. But the Afterschool Alliance was super excited to work with Sarah and the whole team over there at Children's Funding Project and Grantmakers for Education on the fact sheet. We really see it as helping programs and state and local level state and local advocates understand and explore the possible after-school funding opportunities, after-school and summer funding opportunities that are out there. Periodic surveys of the field, there we go, that the Afterschool Alliance has done really over the last 3 or 4 years, consistently show that funding and sustaining after-school and summer programs is a top concern for the field. And obviously with the, as was mentioned, with the American Rescue Plan ESSER obligation deadline coming up the obligation deadline is about 10 months away now, liquidation deadline a little after that. The need for accessible program funding is greater than ever. And the slide really, showing that up there with right behind finding staff to hire and sort of the staffing shortage issue, which I know this group has talked about. We've had webinars on the past and we'll continue to focus on that in the future as well. But the funding piece is continues to be as pressing as ever. Just a little bit of context in terms of where we are with the funding cliff. For context, we estimate about $8.1 billion in state and local American Rescue Plan ESSER funds, elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds. That's the ESSER. Were directed to after school and summer learning or enrichment programs. That's since 2021, so it doesn't account the first two tranches of federal COVID relief. About $5.4 billion of that was by local school districts. Just under $3 billion, 2.7 or so was state education agency, state set-aside funds, mainly through grant competitions to local community-based organizations and schools and others to support after school and summer. Those funds, again, I mentioned the obligation deadline, the liquidation deadline, or so the spending, as it were, for those funds is late January 2025. And the graph shows that local breakdown as well of the $5.4 billion. And that's from a report on American Rescue Plan funding that our research team and fellows in our office worked on, and it was actually released about a month ago, middle of last month. So it's estimated that just over half of the LEA ESSER funds are actually still available to be spent, about 53%. Is sort of the latest numbers on that. Some of that's been obligated, some of that's about half been obligated, half hasn't. So there's still opportunities for those funds. However, as anyone with the school district will tell you, there is a hesitancy to start a new program now because of this sustainability question of moving forward. I'll say too, in addition, the National League, our friends at the National League of Cities estimates that cities have used about $4 billion now on American Rescue Plan local fiscal recovery funds. So those were funds through the Department of Treasury to support after school and summer programs since 2021. The runway for those funds is a little longer. So those funds have to be spent by late December 2026. But when you add those all together, that's about $12 billion in total investment of American Rescue Plan funds that have been made into after school and summer, which is great and represents almost about 6 million young people who got access to after school summer as a result of this federal COVID relief funding. But it's also obviously a challenge, and why this fact sheet and the focus on that many of us have been working on sustaining funding is so key. So we know that the need for programs will remain after that funding expires, and we know the impact of participation in the programs requires that we all really work together to find a way to sustain these investments. Sustaining and growing the work, and remember, there's that 6 million, but there's really 25 million students out there we estimate that would be in a program if were available. 11 million low income students really is going to take a holistic approach. So as was mentioned earlier, increasing federal, state, and local funding, private sector, philanthropic funding and partnership, braiding from all levels will be essential. Creativity and innovation will be critical. Continuing to help programs build their capacity, as Sarah just mentioned, on that previous slide. The capacity is key to be able to successfully apply and manage, to apply for grants and manage the grants as well. And those are roles that many funders, but also even we would argue some of the federal funding and government funding grants can be used to help build some of that capacity for programs as well. And we saw some of that with the American Rescue Plan funding. So the fact sheet, encourage, if you haven't looked at it already, to get it out and take a look. It really helps lay out how advocates and providers can come together at all levels and identify and grow funding streams that support programs in their communities. Pre-COVID, the annual federal investment after school was somewhere around 2.5 to 3 billion, mostly through 21st Century Community Learning Centers, Child Care Development Block Grant, things like TANF, AmeriCorps, and dozens of other federal funding streams that contributed smaller amounts as well. So the fact sheet points to a couple of great databases and resources. The one from the Wallace Foundation in conjunction with Ed Council, the Children's Funding Project's own federal funding database, which is a great resource. At the Afterschool Alliance, we have a database and a couple of resources to help around the funding piece as well. But that existing funding at the federal level, while super important, we all know won't be enough to meet the need, especially as the cost of running programs continues to grow. So the combination of the cliff, as well as needing to pay and wanting and needing to pay staff more and other costs that continue to increase, are really driving the efforts that we need to continue to advocate both for the federal funding streams as well as, and we'll talk about later, the state and local as well. So create the case for increases in the amounts of funding available, as well as making that funding more accessible to local providers. So it's a two for the appropriation sort of spending side, increasing the available pie, as you if you will, but also acknowledging and realizing that some of the that there are barriers to accessing some of the existing grants and the need to continue to advocate to address those barriers. As an advocate myself at the federal level, continuing to look forward to continuing to work with all the advocates that we have worked with in the past and continue to, parents, providers, young people, pediatricians, teachers, law enforcement, employers, and others. I just want to do a really quick aside. I'm cognizant of time, but a quick aside here too around acknowledging the federal fiscal landscape and that it's a challenge. And if you were paying attention this week, there was an education spending bill debated on the House floor that really would have gutted a lot of the support for young people. However, it was pulled due to lack of votes on Wednesday. And that's really a victory, I would argue, for advocates of education programs and for advocates of young people. And also a reminder, we faced really tough challenges before at the federal level around elimination of 21st century and after school funding. And we've always worked together to come out stronger in the end. And so I feel like despite the fiscal challenges at the federal level, the advocacy will continue to be important there as well. That said, there's tremendous, as I mentioned, momentum at the local level and the state level as well. Currently, 21 states and District of Columbia fund after school and summer programs with state funding for a total of just under $5 billion in 2023. Now, the vast majority of that $5 billion is in California, but we know we need to grow the number of states that are funding after school and summer and increase the amount of states, increase the actual amount by which states are funding programs for the states that already do. And again, the good news is there's momentum. 4 states that never funded after school before passed legislation this year to create state funding streams, and then another in 2022 as well in Alabama, and then the other 4 on here on the map. And that's really a result of tremendous advocacy at the state and local level, but also really showing the impact of the state level ARP funds. And a number of those states supported grant programs that had tremendous impacts on local communities and on students and families. And lawmakers paid attention to that. So building on that momentum is going to be critical. The fact sheet walks through different opportunities and possible revenue streams at the state level, things like budget line items, like a number of these examples, but other pieces as well. And then local funding, right? As we've all talked about, is super key. Mayors and city councils have always been champions for after school and summer and youth programs in general. They've supported park and rec and library and police athletic leads, but also they've also supported nonprofit providers and even in some communities, school run programs. to provide after school and summer. And as Sarah mentioned, the fact she has really good examples there as well. And with that, I'm really excited now to have a conversation with Maxine Quintana from Denver about the amazing work that they're doing there to support programs both in the past and now, but also looking towards the future. So we'll transition to that now. And first of all, Maxine, if you want to just talk a little bit about, introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your the work in Denver, and then we'll go from there.
Sure, happy to do so. So I'm Maxine Quintana. I am with the City of Denver's Office of Children's Affairs. Believe it or not, I've been with the city for 33 years now, and in our office since it was created in the mid-90s, really to support youth efforts. So a long history of support for out-of-school time in our office. Our funding has ebbed and flowed over the years, and somehow we always managed to survive. I'm on my 5th mayor now, and the work just continues to grow. So happy to be here to talk to you guys all today. Erik, you want me to just jump into?
Yeah, I was going to say, can you share a brief overview of how Denver succeeded with allocating the marijuana tax revenue for programs and sort of getting into the role that philanthropic funders played in that, either advocacy or in supporting implementation?
Sure. Honestly, I happened to be in the right place at the right time, armed with good data and stories, which allowed me to advocate for out-of-school time as a solid prevention strategy for these funds. And really, it was as simple as that. Being prepared with good data and stories and being able to share that with city leaders at that time. So I should mention, well, I just did, that our office has a long history of OST, right? And when marijuana was first legalized, almost 10 years ago, Denver was smart that they instituted a special tax that was really focused on local things, but the ordinance language was really vague. And so it had like one small portion in it that was dedicated to education and public health programs. So there was a lot of room to, really shape how those funds were spent. And being the first to legalize marijuana, it was all new territory for us, right? And so we didn't really have a lot of philanthropic funders or other people at the table. Instead, the conversations were really focused on city leaders and what we wanted to do. And every department head was included. And I happened to be at this meeting one day representing our agency. And because of our history, and I had the data, that I was able to advocate for out-of-school time programs as a solid prevention strategy. And it was really as simple as that. I say that, and then I go back and I think really about like, what were those key things that were in place? And it's really about having that local data that you can share with your leaders. More so than anything is what I'd really like to. If you don't take anything away from me today, make sure that's what you take away, that you have to have the data and the stories to tell, right? And to be able to share and advocate and just be in the right rooms at the right time, which is tricky. Sometimes you never know when that's going to happen, right? But honestly, it was as simple as that. The other thing I'd say is we were able to demonstrate our impact and get the dollars out the door quickly because we had a good solid infrastructure in place already. So I mean, that made it a little bit more simpler, but what we were able to do was the first money we received, we were able to show impact related right back to the marijuana tax revenue stream. And within that next year, they doubled our budget. A couple years later, it became really our base budget for supporting youth. And it was all because of our efforts in terms of sharing data back with city leaders.
That's awesome. Thanks for kind of walking through that process. Can you talk a little bit about how the funding was distributed once you got that funding, kind of who it went to, how much, and what that looked like, sort of the implementation process?
Sure. Well, right off the top, I took about 25% of the funds that we were awarded to support the work of our after-school intermediary, the Denver Afterschool Alliance, which was just recently formalized with the support of the Wallace Foundation. So we had been doing systems building work in our community for many, many years, providing free professional learning to the field, tools and resources to measure impact, all those kinds of things. But we didn't really formalize our system until 2012. So right off the top, I took some funding to support our systems building work, which was really great. And then I had our Denver Afterschool Alliance team really serve as the technical assistance partner to the award recipients that were funded through the city's RFP processes. So 50% of the funds are basically used to fund a multi-year process that supports comprehensive programs. Again, those are the programs that are providing the consistent services in a community throughout the school year and the summer. We have 12 comprehensive partners that are awarded about $60,000 to $130,000 in a calendar year with marijuana tax revenue funding. And then with our ARPA dollars, we funded summer programming specifically for those 12 comprehensive partners, because again, we didn't want to create new programs. We wanted to really focus and provide consistent services in the communities that we were supporting. And so those organizations get another $80,000 to $225,000 each summer through 2026, already set aside and allocated for them through our ARPA funding. Then we also have a small pot of funds, maybe another 25%, that is used to support an annual RFP process that really just funds content specific and single subject type programs. We have about 30 partners that we award. Those grants range from around $20,000 to $50,000 a year.
And that's awesome. And interested to talk a little bit more about how that sort of fits into the approach, sort of the braiding question, right? So when the school district got ARP funds and the mayor of the city as well, the treasury funds, like how those were able to work together. But before we jump into that, I know there was a question in the chat around the data piece. So the specifics of the sort of type of data that was effective in sort of making the case was a question from the chat.
So I'd say there were really two types of data that we collect routinely is community needs data. So like we do an annual or a survey of a simple survey done through social media and done through all of our partners that really capture the voice of community members, whether they're users of out-of-school time services or non-users of services. And we really just want to capture their support for programming. We turn that into a simple one-page brief and we really try and focus on, we just actually did one, and I could put the document in the chat so that you can have access to it. Basically, we had 1,300 respondents. It took us 2 weeks to do. Representation from every single city council district, both users and non-users. And overwhelmingly, our community says these programs are a necessity. They're not a luxury. They are a necessity so that families could work, and they should be provided at low or no cost. And so little things like that. We also do, so from the provider perspective, we invest heavily in quality improvement. And so we use the YPQI, which I'm sure people are familiar with. We also use the SEO, which gives that youth perception. But again, having stories to say that 3 out of 4 kids, feel like they do better on their grades. I mean, just little facts that show collectively as a system that out-of-school time programs support the development of youth, help families get back to work, all of those different things. And again, so pretty much we use like attendance data, school district data, we use PQA data, we use SEO data, and then we get community data just really through surveys and such. So it's not comprehensive, it's not fancy, but when you add a little cute market brief to it, it really helps you be able to tell that story when you're out building relationships with policy leaders.
No, I appreciate that. I think it's such a key point in that there are different messages that respond to different audiences, and comprehensive after school programs can do address a whole host of outcomes. And so for some, it is the academic piece or the engagement, the attendance, but for other, it is really the importance of for working families. And so being able to show a variety of those and appeal to that broad range of audiences is key. Thanks for getting into that a little bit more. Can you talk a little bit about the again, sort of the braiding piece and how the funding kind of fits into the quilt, if you will, of resources that programs need to be able to really serve families and young people?
Sure. So we knew from our partnerships with the school district that they were focusing their ESSER dollars on the school year, on school year programming, right? On programs that happened in the school year. Again, all the comprehensive partners are basically the same. There are only so many partners in a city, right, doing this work. And so because the school district was focused on providing support to our partners for those services, school year services. That's why we focused our ARPA funds on summer. So again, we could leverage so that we had support for families the entire calendar year, so to speak. We had, because we were a Wallace funded city for several years, we kind of took a break, to be honest, from reaching out to our local philanthropic community to bring in additional resources. We had good, sufficient funding from the city to make a good case. And there were a lot of other things there. That didn't mean that we weren't at the table with our funders and that we weren't sharing what we were doing, and that what we were really trying to advocate for was having some common alignment between our providers and how they work together, and between the funders about what we ask our providers for, how we measure success in our funding strategies and those kinds of things. So we had a lot of conversations with our funding community and a lot of alignment there, but not so much blending and braiding from that perspective, because we felt that we were okay having such a good solid base of city funding and working with the school district, who had really never contributed to this space before in terms of funding. Yes, in-kind stuff, but now actually had dollars. So we also were very, very cognizant about not wanting to create a bunch of new programs with this money. We wanted to invest in sustainability and making sure that there was consistency in the communities that had been there supporting our families this whole time. And as it was mentioned earlier, the cost of services just went up tremendously, right? Our minimum wage in Denver is like almost 19, well, it's $18.85 an hour. That went up so much. The cost of just doing business doubled, really. And so we didn't do a lot of new programming. We did a lot of investment into our current partners who were already providing that stable services.
Thank you for that. I appreciate kind of talking that through. Last question, then I'll hand it back to Rebecca, and we'll kind of go into more questions in the chat. But obviously, many jurisdictions don't have the cannabis revenue available. Can you talk through kind of advice for other communities who are looking to maybe pursue a similar tax revenue strategy, maybe not necessarily cannabis? So we know there's ones out there on nicotine products, particularly sort of vaping and some of those, or settlements, alcohol, sports betting. And it was mentioned in the chat, the opioid lawsuits in at least one state. We know both states and localities potentially have some of those fundings coming. Maybe it's going back to the sort of the data making the case, sure. But what is some of the advice there?
The other thing I'd say is, yes, while we have a little pot of funding from our marijuana tax revenue, it's not nearly what we need to support out of school time programs. So we too are on a path of looking at either a larger carve out of marijuana tax revenue or a tax ballot initiative that is focused solely on support from comprehensive OST. We had a part of our team at the Children's Funding Project meeting a couple of weeks ago, and we are really galvanizing our youth service provider community to have that one shared voice to be able to advocate as a system. And I think that's super, super important when you have, and matter of fact, we just finished, because again, we just had a new election. So we have all new city, well, not all new, but a bunch of new city council members. We have a new mayor. And so what we did was we prepared our coalition members, our organization leaders, to go out and advocate directly to city council. And so they're out there on our behalf talking about the needs of the field, not just representing their organization, but those needs of the field. So I think, again, making sure that you have that local data, that you have that voice from the organizations who are directly serving kids is super, super important. I'd say the other thing that really helped us in the long run, and I think you could really do this with any type of syntax really, is in our first allocation of marijuana tax funding, I knew that we needed something to tie back specifically to marijuana, right? And so we created a really simple curriculum that was just focused on what kids knew and what questions they were having. And we did it really honestly at the request of the field, because they were getting so many questions from youth about marijuana, because it was all over the place, right? This was a new landscape for everybody, and providers sought out to us to say, hey, what do we do? How do we answer these questions? Kids want to know, right? And so we pulled together a group of providers, and we had developed a very simple marijuana education and awareness curriculum is what we called it. And it was really just sharing simple facts along with all the tools that kids needed to make healthy decisions for themselves. And again, having that data from that very first year of funding, first summer of funding, to be honest, helped us not only double the amount that we were bringing in from these dollars, but it also helped us establish that as basically our base funding in the city. I will say that in this last year, we expanded the curriculum and we added 2 new components, one around vaping and another around opioid use. So again, it's not really about the substances. It's really more focused on social emotional learning skills and on healthy decisions. But if you add in just enough of those elements, and I'm happy to share all this stuff afterwards, it can help you tie that right back into that syntax resource and have data that will help you, make the case that this is a good use of funds.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that overview. It was super helpful. Rebecca?
Great. Thank you so much. Maxine, super helpful to hear about how this looks in Denver, the successes that you've had. There was a question in the chat, and I'm curious, Maxine, if you want to answer, or anyone here, around understanding, where programs are and where the needs are. So you've done some of that surveying. We know some communities are doing mapping. Has that led, in from any of your perspectives, directly to saying, here's where we need more funding and directing it to certain pockets of the community?
100%. So again, that's a lot of the work that the Denver Afterschool Alliance, our after-school intermediary, does, right? They understand the needs of the field, where programs are at, where kids are at, where there's successes, where there's not. So, that is definitely helpful. And again, I'm happy to share all that. I didn't really do a fantastic job of letting you know more about what the Denver Afterschool Alliance does, but we have a very robust management information system that serves as our city's youth program locator and has all kinds of backdoor stuff to help organizations measure youth impacts and then share the data. So yes, it's super helpful to do that. I'm happy to have conversations with any afterwards to kind of dig into some of those elements a little bit deeper if that's necessary. But yeah, again, having that local data to kind of understand your community and being able to tie it into a specific city council district when you go and meet with that council member, right, is super helpful, because that's what they want to hear. They want to hear what their constituents need. And it doesn't have to cost a lot. This new survey that we just did, and I'll make sure I grab that. Literally, we put it out via social media more so than anything, and through our city council offices, and simple one pager, couple $1,000, really not expensive to do, but the data, gosh, is so helpful, is all I could say, to really put it into that local context.
Great. And I see that Emily in the chat is also adding in some links and resources there. So thank you for that, Emily. I wanted to go back to the question around adequate compensation for staff. So I know that came up as a question early in our session from someone in the audience. And then Maxine, you acknowledged the reality of minimum wage going up, but overall cost of living going up. Erik, Sarah, or Maxine, how do programs do this in a sustainable way?
So one of the things that we did was we brought, again, our provider community together so that we're not making these decisions for them, or we're making these decisions with them. And they all agreed on basically what a funding model looks like for a comprehensive out-of-school time program, and how to split that. And again, some needs are different if you're in a community-based setting or if you're in a school setting, of course. But on the gist of it, we got our provider's voice. And so when we are out there advocating, it's with the lens of the field, I think, if that makes sense. And so I think that's really important and critical is to convene your providers and bring their voice into whatever it is that you develop to tell that story of what it costs to run these programs. And then that way it arms them with an ability to not only advocate for their own organization, but for the field.
Mm-hmm. And Maxine, there's a request in the audience from Jennifer, if you're willing to share the community needs survey and brief.
Oh, sure. I'm happy to share anything. It's just going to take me a second to
send it to me. We'll put it together in resources. Great. So we're towards the end of our call here. We do have, this is a funder community plus field leaders, but I'm curious, advice to funders here. I know there was a question earlier around, funding grassroots advocacy, how to engage your community funders more. I'm going to go to Sarah first, and then we'll just go around quick answers. What would you suggest in terms of, what a key role funders can play here?
Yeah, I would definitely say funding local and state organizations to convene but also get the messaging around, you know, like Maxine said, the needs. If there's a community needs a specific survey or a state survey that they can lean on, and really bringing out of school time providers into those conversations as well. So working as a convening partner, funding those activities, and going to the ballot, or looking at some of those you know, public revenue sources that could potentially be a good match to really galvanize all of those individuals and organizations together. I think collectively, like that's one of the most beautiful things that you can hope for and see. And Maxine, just hearing you, I was like getting chills. I was like, that's so amazing when that happens, and that that momentum comes together to keep pushing. So
thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly add to, I totally agree. I think so. Every state has a statewide after school network. Sarah mentioned that as well. And for funders that can't advocate, or rather can't fund direct sort of lobbying efforts, the public awareness building, the research piece, the capacity building, identifying and helping doing need through surveys. We do a lot of that at the Afterschool Alliance through America After 3 p.m., partnering with local jurisdictions or states to help collect that data. But then I also think, you know, a role for funders, for providers themselves, again, around sort of the capacity building piece of helping them. And we've seen this a lot, you know, in the early days of ARP, and even with 21st Century Community Learning Centers, making sure local sort of smaller nonprofit providers and even school districts who maybe are under-resourced in some respect have the capacity to be able to manage and go after some of these larger, more sophisticated federal grants, are able to, you know, meet the compliance requirements, are able to understand grant writing and get past those competitive measures in place, are able to understand how you establish a data sharing agreement with your school district. Those are all sort of capacity building pieces that, you know, state after school networks can help with, local intermediaries, every hour counts, you know, those like Denver, those intermediaries can help with, but for the providers themselves, to the extent that, and it's always a challenge to get funding to really sort of address those barriers and build that capacity.
Great. Thanks for pointing that out. And last word, Maxine?
I would totally agree. If you have an after school intermediary, fund your intermediary. They are the ones who have the ability to coordinate the field, to leverage those resources to have a greater impact, and to bring the field of providers together, and funders as well, right? And to be able to share all that data. So fund your intermediaries. And if you have to fund programs directly, focus on comprehensives, because they have the most opportunity of getting the impact that you want to see for youth.
Great. Okay. Great advice. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you have a restful week ahead of you with some time off with loved ones. I put in the chat some of our upcoming programs. You'll see there's a theme around the workforce that is intentional. So we're going to be talking about that in our next month's call, as well as our next funder meetup for Ed Funders members. And we're also sponsoring an in-person event in Los Angeles to look at the California expanded learning workforce. So lots of upcoming opportunities. Please reach out if you have questions. Otherwise, we will hopefully see you again next month. Thank you.